Impressionism. So avant-garde, right? These were cutting-edge artists who were trying to link the historical glory of German painting. So they were looking at people like Dürer, right? Remember the German Northern Renaissance printmaker, painter Dürer, Grunewald, right? As well as Kranich, right? The allegory of law and grace. You guys remember that one? And so they were looking at them and trying to reestablish kind of the art tradition in Germany, but in a new way. And so a lot of it was based on Nietzsche's theory of journey of self-discovery. Their style was very much influenced. Sorry, it's really loud in the hall right now. I'm gonna close the door.
Sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so they were much influenced by the fogs. So the colors, the emotional content of the fogs. Like I said, they wanted to link the future with the past, and they did a lot of abstraction. So they exaggerated and distorted their forms. They used really bright colors, and they often discussed the ills of society. There we go. Sorry about that, Alana. Thank you for your chat. So you guys see it now? Okay, sorry about that. So there we have the bridge, right? So the bridge was often based on modern life, right? And so when you look at this painting, right, it's representing the like wealthy elite of the day, right? You can see people kind of in fancy clothing, men in top hats, right? Women kind of angular, right? And you can see that he uses unrealistic color. And that's really coming from that Fauvist tradition, right? That Fauvist tradition of using unrealistic color to show the emotional content of the artist and how they view their subject matter. So he was looking at a lot of the ills of society. So like some of the French painters we saw, these were high scale like sex workers. These women with these fancy hats, they would meet men on bridges, which is strange considering their name was the girl. And they would, go about their way, right? So when we look at his subject matter, you can see that he's looking at kind of like high society of the day, right? And that leads us to the piece that's in the 250, which is a little bit different than some of his other works. So this is a self-portrait of the artist, and it's a self-portrait of the artist as a soldier. So we've been looking at Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. I didn't say his name earlier, so I apologize. Kirchner. And so his style is pretty easy to recognize. It's very angular, right? Normally he's doing contemporary scenes with contemporary people. And so the one that they chose in the 250, which is 133, your note takers, make sure you're taking notes as we're going through these, is of himself. So once again, a contemporary subject matter of himself. And so what I want us to do is just to look at it really closely. So we're going to just take a few moments to visually analyze this piece. So what do we see in the foreground as well as the background? So just take a few moments to look at it. What do we see in the foreground? What do we see in the background? So this would be your content. So what's in the foreground? That's your front. What's in the front of the painting? Katie, what do you think? What's in the very front of the painting?
It's like an officer kind of, and he's like smoking.
Yep. So we have a man dressed in a soldier's uniform. He actually wasn't an officer, but that we'll get to in a little bit. But we see that he's in a military uniform and he's smoking. Is there anything else that's odd about the artist? Anything else odd about the artist? Anyone notice?
He's missing a hand.
He's missing a hand. Yeah. So think about that. What would it be like for an artist to be missing his hand? Remember that the bridge, right, is connecting the past with the future, but they're also talking about their emotions, right? And so Kirchner, in reality, never lost his hand, right? He's not like, Van Gogh, who lost part of his actual ear, right? He didn't lose his hand. It's a symbol, right? What could that be a symbol of? What would losing a hand be a symbol of for an artist? What do you think? I wish I had a treat to throw at you for responding. Cora, any guesses?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry. Maybe it's like he's worked so hard that like his hand has like been worn off. I don't know.
Oh, I like that interpretation. So he worked so hard that he wore off his hand. That's not the correct interpretation, but I like it, right? And I like that you took a risk, right? Is he dressed as an artist? No, right? So we have an artist who's dressed as a soldier who's missing a hand. What could that symbolize? Yeah, come on.
Like do his like passion.
Not being able to do his passion. So in World War I, Kirchner was, I just flipped the slide, so we got the background there too, but that's okay. Kirchner was not able to be a soldier. He was deemed mentally unstable, but he was a driver. And so World War I kept him away from being able to paint, which is his true calling, right? Which was his true calling. And so he showed himself with a severed hand to kind of explain that idea of missing his ability to be able to paint, right? His true calling, his true profession. And so in the background, you notice that the red, right, is very jarring. Red is a very emotional color. We saw Chagall, not Chagall, but Gauguin. Remember Gauguin? We have that one painting with the gold, but there's other paintings that I showed you guys with red, right? Jacob wrestling the angel. And red is very shocking. So we've got this red behind him. And when you look at the red, it's not solid, it's very textural. So I can see thick marks of paint on that canvas. And these rectangular, angular things are representations of his painting, right? So we actually have paintings by Kirchner behind him. And that's what that nude is there too. It's actually on the surface of a canvas, right? So we have in that rectangular space, those are his paintings that he's not able to do because he's enlisted in the military, right? So thinking about how he portrays himself, right? He's an artist unable to make art, right? He also was very much traumatized by, is his art good enough, right? He had some mental issues, and so he really, was always feeling a little bit down on himself. I shouldn't say a little bit down on himself. He was feeling very down on himself. And so he was always wondering, is my art good enough? And he really felt that the war was ruining his creative spirit. It was taking away something that was essential to his being. And so, like I said, in the war, he was a driver because he was deemed unfit to serve. Right? And so how is this work similar to like the work by Matisse. Remember the fogs and Matisse, right? How is it expressive, right? It has that vivid, rich color, right? It has a sense of angularness, possibly based on looking at what they deem to be more primitive art. Once again, when I say primitive art, I don't mean that it is primitive art, but sadly they would have, right? And so looking at the angularness of it, right? And looking at maybe like masks from Africa, which were part of a lot of ethnographic museums in Europe. And he would have had, seen some of these examples. So notice how long the face is, how we have those really defined kind of rounded arches to his eyebrows, the simplified shape of his eyes are very reminiscent to some of the masks that we saw. Right? Kirchner in World War II, right, or at the beginning of World War II, actually commits suicide. And I had mentioned before that he was very much traumatized by art. And so this probably isn't on the AP exam, but I think it's really important to understanding the history of art to understand the degenerate art show. So we're going to watch this short video here on the Trout Museum in Germany. Kind of understand why Kirchner would have taken his own life.
We're standing in Munich, looking at the House of Art, which was once called the House of German Art.
It was built for Adolf Hitler and was a place to promote a very specific idea of German art.
This is thought to be the very first building that Hitler had commissioned for the Nazi state, and this was to be the first of many buildings that were to be constructed around the nation that were the embodiment of National Socialist ideology.
As we look at this building, it's hard not to notice that the Nazis were drawing on the classical tradition of ancient Greek and Roman architecture.
Yes, but by way of 19th century classical revival traditions, especially in Germany. We might think of the work of Schinkel up in Prussia, in Berlin especially, and we might think of the work of Klenze here in Munich. These were artists that took the ancient tradition and appropriated them for their age. This building is a little bit different. It is even more spare. It is even more stripped down. But we can see this long Doric colonnade on the side, giving a sense of order and power.
And I think timelessness is another word that we should use about this architecture. There was an aspiration toward the eternal or timelessness, that ancient Greek architecture stood for those very values that the Nazis wanted to embody, as opposed to what they considered degenerate art or sickly, unhealthy art that was actually exhibited just a few blocks away.
There were two major exhibitions of art that were opened in 1937 that were meant to be seen in opposition to each other, and they were only about a block and a half from each other. The great exhibition of German art opened here at the House of German Art, but then in a temporary exhibition space was the first iteration of the Untitled Kunst exhibition, the degenerate art exhibition.
We use that word degenerate, and what it really meant for the Nazis was an art that was sickly and unhealthy, the art that today we hold as most dear. If you go to modern art museums, you'll be looking at the art the Nazis considered degenerate. Artists like Schmidt-Rottluff or Paul Klee or Max Ernst, Kirchner, all of the great early modernists. And those artists were drawing on so-called primitive art. They deformed the human body. They used extreme colors. They distorted space. These were all things that Hitler rejected. He was looking for an art that was ideal and beautiful and perfect, and that represented a kind of timelessness.
So this architecture and the art that was meant to house were tied up in National Socialist ideology. Germany had gone through a very rapid industrialization, and the National Socialists, the Nazis, looked back to a kind of invented agrarian past that they romanticized. And so the contemporary ills that came with industrialization, that came with urbanization, were vilified. And art that was representative of those changes, kind of international character, a kind of risk-taking, all of the aspects that we associate with modern art is something that was vilified. And this building was built specifically as a kind of antidote.
And you could say that another aspect of modern art is that it's constantly changing, right? There's Cubism and Futurism and Dadaism and all of these movements always trying to stay contemporary, as opposed to what Hitler was wanting for the Third Reich, which was timeless.
In fact, Hitler spoke to this directly.
In the speech that Hitler gave on the opening of the first exhibition, he said, "Until the moment when National Socialism took power, there existed in Germany a so-called modern art. That is, to be sure, almost every year another one. National Socialist Germany, however, wants again a German art."
We're gonna stop with that because they're no longer talking about the degenerate art show. But basically what the Third Reich did is they put together a collection of things they thought was unfit, which was not a good representation of German art or of art of modern society. Because of course the Germans wanted to basically, take over all of Europe. And so there was a lot of French artists, Russian artists. If I look at this photo, here's Kandinsky, which we'll talk about later today. So, they were looking at anyone that wasn't like super realistic, like Dürer, right? Hitler's favorite painter was Kranich, right? Who we talked about with Allegory of Law and Order. And so Kirchner took his own life because of being placed in this degenerate art show and thinking that his art wasn't worth anything. So there are other expressionists who don't really fit into Fauvism or don't fit into the Bridge or the Blue Rider, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so one of those is Käthe Kollwitz. She is really known for a lot of her self-portraits, and she would do them in pencil, and she also did a lot in printmaking. And so a lot of her prints in particular have kind of political undertones to them. A lot of artists were rebelling from what they saw happening in their region in World War II, and then of course in between the wars, and then of course leading into World War II. And so when we look at her pieces, maybe we can see where her political leaning is, right? So here we have a man with his arm raised. Here we have a woman embracing children, and then there's blindfolded people behind. Here we have a woman with an incredibly small coffin, right? And so she was looking at a lot of art of the less fortunate, right? The underrepresented, represented. And she really was interested in the social causes of the day and the social ills. So why would she use printmaking, right? Why would she use printmaking for her imagery, right? Why would she use printmaking, right? A, it's very German, right? In the tradition of other German artists, right? Remember that the printing press was like invented in Europe in this day. Of course, it was invented in Asia earlier, but it was invented in Germany. And then we have this tradition of people like Dürer and Kranich and other artists who were printing images, because remember, you can propagate your images. You can show your images to numerous people, right, to get across your message or your prestige or your artistic skill. And so she was really recalling that historical German past in her prints, right? No kind of social causes. And that leads us to 134. It's called the Memorial Sheet of Karl Liebknecht, right, by Käthe Kollwitz. So let's break this one down. Let's look at what is the focal point. Where do our eyes go in this print, right? It's a woodcut print. I can tell it because it's really high contrast and has very limited amounts of rendering to it, right? Where does our eye go? Maroon, can you help me out? Where does your eye go?
It goes to like the man in the center, like bending over the sheet.
Right, so this
With,
here, our circling. eyes probably go to that man that Vern was mentioning, this guy kind of leaning over, as well as the man in white, right? So it's kind of this group in this lower right corner. And so think about how your eye travels there, right? Kollwitz was using contrast, right? She was using the dramatic difference between light and dark, right? Notice that there's this light around the edge of Liebknecht's head. It's almost like a halo, right? It's not a halo, but it's like a halo because it's very light and his head is very dark. And then he's wearing, right, a very white, like shroud, right? And everything else in this image is very dark, especially close to him. Notice how all the men who are leaning over, right, they're very dark. It gets a little bit lighter in the faces of the people behind, but the thing, that contrast between light and dark really leads you there, right? And then in the tradition of people like Giotto, right? Remember Giotto, right? When we have the lamentation of Christ, Liebknecht is almost given a Christ-like status, right? All these people are leaning towards, their faces are leaning towards his body, they're angled towards his body. And this is a tradition we've been seeing over and over again repeated in history, right? So this is a part of that continuity of style, right? That continuity of style, like how it's similar. It's printmaking, which is traditional German. It's got the leading figures, right? So that we notice what's most important. And then lastly, it's kind of just focusing on how she divides the composition. So notice that we have like the faces of the masses in the background. And then there's this front group of men kind of in black, right? And they're the ones that are closest to the leader. And then we have Liebknecht himself at the very bottom. So it's organized in kind of horizontal levels in a rather shallow space. This is not visually in depth as like the Goya print that we saw, right? Remember the soldiers shooting at the captives of the war, right? So what was her motivation for making her work, and why was she working in woodcut? We mentioned the woodcut issue before, but she was very much an anti-war artist. She actually lost a son in conflict. I can't remember which war. I'm not actually sure if it was a great war like World War I or not. But she actually lost a son. And so a lot of her images were based on anti-war. And she would often sell her prints to the middle class. And so even though she personally was not a communist, she did know of Liebknecht, right, who was a communist leader, and she did admire a lot of his teachings, right? So that's why she showed him kind of like a Christ-like figure. And then once again, why is she working in woodcut? Because it was a traditional German media, right? It was also viewed as primitive. It was viewed as being a little bit more crude or refined, or even looking at like the traditional historical past of the region. And she can make multiples and circulate her messages. And of course, not just her message, but also the messages that she liked from Liebknecht. Any questions on Käthe Kollwitz? Excuse me. I see people dying down from those, so it's time to take a pause and clear my throat. I had to talk at all yesterday because of the SAT, so my throat's a little rough today. Okay, so the next group, which I forgot to delete this information, disregard the flashcards view, is we're going to be looking at how Cubism challenges tradition. So here we actually saw Lady of Avignon before. It's at the MoMA in New York. But this gives you a little idea of the size of the painting. One of the things that I find that I don't like about the artwork in the 250 is that you don't need to know the size. And I think that size of the work really does help with your understanding sometimes. So I like to include as many of those images as I can. It has helped you. Oh, my animation was off. I practiced this yesterday and everything. But we're going to look at Picasso first, right? We're going to look at Picasso and then we'll move to Braque. And so this is a portrait of Picasso at a very young age. He was pretty much a child prodigy in painting, and he could paint very, very realistic by the time he was, I want to say like 12, right? He was very, very skilled. And so he's a Spanish painter, and he made his way to Paris because, of course, Paris was the center of the art world. And so in his early work, he emulated a lot of the painters that were kind of like the previous tradition. So he would look at impressionist painters, symbolist painters, and so on. And so some of his early pieces are very much based on symbolism. And of course, you guys have probably heard of Picasso and his blue period. Here is a self-portrait of himself in his blue period. What does the color blue often represent in Western art? What does the color blue symbolize? What mood comes from it? Isabella, can you help me?
Like sadness.
Sadness. And so when he first gets to Paris, he's incredibly poor, right? He's excited to be in this, great artistic city, right? All these artists and musicians and poets, and he's meeting all these new people, but he's so poor and he's hungry. And you actually can see that he looks hungry in his face. He's got sunken in cheeks, even though he's overall blue, he's got this kind of yellowish sort of sickly hue to his face. And so in the blue period, he's very much kind of like depressed about being kind of like not famous. He's sick, he's tired, right? Of kind of establishing his career. And so he paints a lot of paintings in this blue period, right? And then eventually he moves into his rose period. And this one, it's kind of hard to see. It's not like the blue period where most of the painting is blue, but in the rose period, he starts to introduce like more pinks and more peaches. And they say that one of the reasons for this is that he falls in love for the first time. Probably falls in love maybe 20, 30 more times in his lifetime too. But he becomes more optimistic, and so the color palette does too, right? He starts to gain some popularity. And so he gets a major art patrons, and one of them was the American expatriate Gertrude Stein. And he paints this very famous portrait of her. And when you look at her, there's an element of realism to it, right? There's an element of realism. I think if I saw a photo of Gertrude Stein, I'd be able to tell that this is her. But can you see any influences of African art in his style? Can you see any influence of African art in his style? Juana, what do you think?
Maybe like the pointy faces and the eye region looks kind of similar too.
Exactly. She's got a very pointy chin, and her eyes are not in particular very realistic. They're kind of like simplified, and then we have that rounded brow again. And that was really common because he was going to museums. He was going to museums and seeing the art from Africa. He was eventually buying art and artifacts from Africa, and he had a collection in his studio. That's what you see here on the left side. But he would not only be looking at African art, but he looked at art from his native Spanish peninsula, looking at the Iberian Peninsula. He was looking at pre-Columbian artwork. He was looking at various styles from all across the world, right? And so in that, he starts to develop Cubism with George Braque. And so the two of them together basically start this new art form, right? So Cubism was influential in early modern movement, pretty much the second half of today, as well as part of Friday. We'll be looking at all these other styles that came from Cubism. It was based on simple geometric shapes in which the subject matter is often broken, altered, and reassembled in an abstract form. So in Cubism, the imagery is often broken apart and then put back together in a new way. It was influenced by the geometric abstraction of African maps. Cézanne, remember Cézanne and his painting of his brushstrokes, right? And not being concerned about how something looks, but how he wants to represent it, right? It's all about the artistic mind rather than what we visually see. And then people like Einstein actually influenced Cubism. So this idea of space-time, quality of reality, being able to see motion, the ability to view things in multiple directions at the same time would have been influenced by things like motion picture, photography, X-rays, all these things that were being invented in this time. So mixing these together. So in a typical Picasso or Braque, you might see parts that belong on the front, the side, the top, the bottom, and maybe a three-quarter, and all merged together. Right, and a lot of this, like I said, was based on new inventions, things like radar, X-rays, as well as, like I said, photography, motion pictures. And there are different types of Cubism. So in R250, we actually have examples of analytical cubism, right? Analytical cubism. We sort of have synthetic cubism in a way as well. And we definitely have collage, but the collage will not be by Picasso or Braque. It will be by Stepanova in Prussia. Right? So we already did Ladies of Avignon in your take-home essay. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but go ahead and flip to 126. Hopefully you still have your notes from previous essays, so that we'll maybe add a little bit to it, or just kind of review it really quickly here. So remember that the style of Cubism was developed when Picasso was trying to make a name for himself. And so he was trying to rebel against the establishment in this new art world. And so what he saw as the establishment was Matisse and Fauvism, right? So even though this style hadn't been around very long, it became popular really fast. And so remember, Picasso's in France, right? He's in Paris, and the rage is Matisse. He is a generation earlier than Picasso, right? So he's already established, and so he's trying to make a name for himself. So this is Joy de Vie or Joy of Life, right? By Matisse. We didn't really break it apart when we looked at it earlier, but this is basically Picasso's reaction to Joy of Life, right? So how are women treated differently in the two images? How are women treated differently? Let's start with just the style. How is the style different? What does the women look like in the Matisse? Eva, can you help me?
The women are a lot more beautiful, and there's more of like this sensual atmosphere, and their forms are accentuated.
Right? So they're sensual, they're very curvy, aren't they? So their detail is based on these really elegant lines that are curvy, and we look at Picasso, his are very angular, right? This is a scene of sexual pleasure, and then the one on the right is kind of like the opposite. It is like being scared to death of these kind of like aggressive sexual predators in these women, right? So here, the female body is kind of being viewed as beautiful, and here it's being viewed as kind of like monstrous, right? And notice the colors, right? Notice the colors. Fauves colors are really what? Who can tell me, Raheel, can you tell me what the Fauves colors are like on the left?
They're very like bright and more vivid, I would say, compared to the
Right, so they're like right out of the tube. Matisse is squeezing paint from the tube and putting it on the brush and kind of painting it straight. And here we have more muted colors, more mixed colors, right? And so Picasso was really trying to like not be Matisse, right? He's trying to make a name for himself. So this work is pretty revolutionary. It's really considered to be the first Cubist painting. And it's kind of a mixture of analytical and synthetic, which we'll describe in a little bit. But how it's revolutionary is that it's rejecting linear perspective, right? It rejects perspective. And so since the Renaissance, artists have used linear perspective to show visual depth, right? We can show a room, we have lines that go back diagonal, things get smaller as they go into the distance, we model light and shadow. And so he's rejecting that. So what he does is he puts all of the figures up close, and there is limited visual depth. There's limited visual depth. And he does that to prove a point, right? He's doing it to create a kind of a claustrophobic feel. It kind of amps up that emotional quality of it. He aggressively made those women seem aggressive, right? And almost crude. He's not using classical poses, which would have been part of that academic tradition of like 50 years previous, right? The figures don't feel as sensual, and instead they are sharp, they are jagged, they almost are like shattered and distorted. So the subject matter, you guys know, right, is prostitutes or sex workers, I should say, right? And this is a tradition that other artists did. So this is a David, and he used the poses from a famous David when he was creating the poses of these women. Right, so here we have the woman kind of with her arms behind her head. Here we have her there as well, right? So this is the part that some of us got on the essay and some of us didn't see, but this is good because now we're really looking at Cubism. And so one of the things that we notice on Cubism is that these artists tend to show multiple points of view at the same time. So let's look at this woman right here in the center. That's a good place to start, right? Or at least maybe we'll end with her too. When we look at her, can you see that her eyes are in a frontal pose? You see that they're symmetrical and there's one on each side of her face, right? So that's like a front pose. But then look at her nose. Now I know some of us are probably pretty crude artists, and we might make the nose look just like this if we were quickly drawing a picture of a person. But this is a profile view of a nose because it only shows one nostril. Can you see that? It's like her face is tilted on the side in one direction. But then her face or her mouth, once again, is a frontal view. And then when I look at her body is twisted. Can you see her body is in a three-quarter view? Notice how her one breast is like almost in the center and the other one is on the right. So it makes it look like her body's twisted. So this is like a three-quarter view. So how could her eyes, her nose, and her body all be in a different point of view at the same time? It can't. And so Picasso and Braque later were really just interested in developing the form, developing the painting, and not the physical reality. They're not trying to be representational, right? They're breaking that artistic tradition, right? And then also, when we look at this view, is she standing? Is the woman in the center standing? Does she look like she's in a standing position? Sort of, but not really. One of the things that it said in the Smart History and also in our textbook is that this woman seems to be laying down. It's like we're hovering above her, looking down on her, like she's laying on a sheet, right? We can even see part of a sheet kind of covering her. But that doesn't make sense with the orientation of the other women, or this other woman who is pulling back the sheet like she's in another space. So there's this ambiguous setting, an ambiguous setting. It is not a representation of a real place. And so with early Cubism, they were really concerned with manipulating that space, manipulating that reality, showing different views at the same time. And honestly, the emotional content is kind of secondary. A lot of his early pieces have no emotional content whatsoever. I just find that his first one actually has some emotional content, which is not typical of early Cubism. So here's just some basic notes about how we have that alternative space. A lot of these I went over already. Notice that the still life is also from an aerial view. It's like we're looking at top of it. So Cubism was analyzing form rather than emotion. So like Cézanne, right, they were constructing a painting. They were not constructing a representation of a mountainside or constructing a representation of these 5 women, right? Picasso was creating a painting. And some of you might be, well, duh, right? But that's the function, right? The function is to distort reality. The function is to create a painting, not to get caught up in what something really looks like. It's really about manipulating the brushstroke, manipulating the angle, the point of view. And so influences, right? We have, like I showed this is not W, this is Ernst. So this is like the guy who did the large autolith, African mask. And then this one right here is influenced by Iberian culture. So this is a sculptural relief that came from the Spanish Peninsula in, like, I want to say before medieval times. So this is kind of like early culture. Right? So here's some other examples. So like I said, Picasso was really thought to paint the very first Cubist painting, but he was going back and forth between his studio and the studio of George Braque. And this is a landscape by George Braque. His painting style and Picasso's painting style are very, very similar. And a lot of his early works, it's hard to tell who is the artist. And the reason being is that they were both, right, painting in this style at the same time, and they were working together to develop this new style of Cubism. George Braque was one of the first people to actually see the Lady of Avignon, or the Ladies of Avignon, and he did not like it, right? So what is this an image of? Can you guys tell what this is an image of? Jasmine, what is it an image of? You see any recognizable imagery?
Oh, I see a violin and also maybe sheet music.
Very good. And so it is a still life, very traditional still life of a violin and some sheet music on a table, right? But it's in this new form, right? So this is a good example of the difference between analytical and synthetic cubism. So same subject matter, violins, right? So analytical cubism is kind of the breaking apart of imagery, and it's typically done in paint. Synthetic cubism was often linked with collage, where they cut and paste imagery, and they would create images by building shapes and forms. So instead of breaking apart, they were constructing the form. So like the table is made out of the shape. Notice how it's not broken up into the building pieces. So analytical cubism, right? These would be some good notes to write down for yourself in your notes on the George Braque, the Portuguese. So you might want to write this down in the style section on the form section, because it is a good example of analytical cubism. So the focus on it is to break apart an object and analyze it. Hence the word analytical. Okay. Artists often shatter, pick apart, and rearrange imagery. They often show objects in multiple views at the same time. So just like the ladies that have been known by Picasso, you're going to see top, bottom, left, right, front, profile, right? You're going to see all of these views at the same time. And part of it was based on how your brain processes, how you view movement, how you learn about your visual information. In this showing of your multiple views, there tends to be a merging of foreground and background. So you don't tend to see a lot of separation between what's in the front and what's in the back. They kind of all seem like it's rather flat. Once again, sort of like Ladies of Avignon, where everything's put up close. There's a very limited palette in a lot of these analytical cubist works. They're typically monochromatic. Mono means what? Mono means what? Jeffrey?
Like one color.
One color. And so often they're in grayscale, so white, black, gray, or they're in monochromatic, a bunch of browns or a bunch of greens. So that's the most common. And then there's minimal texture. And when I talk about minimal texture, I'm not necessarily meaning that you can't see brush stroke, but like the texture of like smooth skin would look exactly like the roughness of hair in a portrait. So there's really no differentiation between the various kinds of textures of objects. Any questions on these? So a lot of analytical cubism is based on common subject matter. The one thing that cubists were not is they were not radical in their subject matter. So they used typical scenes from the traditional painting. So part of that continuity, right, is that they were painting things like still lifes. They were painting portraits and they were painting landscapes. So here's a still life, right? And that leads us to number 130, George Braque, the Portuguese. So this is going to be your piece based on the take-home essay. So we're going to go over some general information, and then we'll go over the take-home essay. Okay? We're not going to do these like answers, but we're going to break apart the questions. Right? So what I'd like you guys to do, and I forgot to mention it to in-person people, go ahead and open up this presentation. This is slide 91. Slide 91. For the at-home people, I'll throw this in the chat for you guys. This is also located on Canvas. However, I want you guys to take some notes in this document. So I'd like you to get started and open it. So it's gonna look like this. Right? So you're gonna open it up, it looks like this, so they can make a copy of it. You guys all getting it? Does everyone have it open? All the at home people, you can put like an icon, a thumbs up if you're done. You got it open? You guys got it open here?
Yeah.
Someone's got it? Eva, do you have it open? Aaron? Is it open? Correct?
Yeah.
Bonnie, you good? Okay, let's go ahead and pick apart the question first. So what we're gonna do is I would like you guys to take some notes right here. Right, I'd like you to take some notes right here. So I don't necessarily have all these notes on the slide, and this is not part of participation. I would like you guys to kind of talk about, and I'll go back and forth between, actually I'll probably stay off of this for you guys, and focus on the essay on the slide. But when we look at this, right, let's just break this apart really fast. So let's take a moment, go ahead and read the question. Go ahead and read the question. Notice that they gave you the artwork, they gave you the identifier, right? And then go ahead and read the question. I'll give you a second. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that you basically have 3 questions. So we have task 1, task 2, and task 3. And so if we look at the first one, which said, using 2 examples of specific visual evidence, explain how this work references established artistic traditions. How many points do you think this is worth in the essay? How many things? Raphael says 2. Does everyone agree with him? Yeah. So underneath this part right here, type in 2 for yourself, right? So it asks you, right? I'm going to delete it because I'll use this as a feature for making my copies. It says using 2 examples, right? It tells you the question. So often, it will say how many things you need to write. That doesn't mean you can't write more. If you know other things, go for it. Just make sure it actually answers the question. Because sadly, if you do something incorrect, you might not get your 2 points. So maybe here you want to do 2, 3, 4 things that would answer the question. Okay? So then the second one is using 2 examples of specific visual evidence. Explain how the work deviates. How many points is that? It's 2 again. Very good. And then the last one is using 2 examples of specific contextual evidence. Explain why the artist deviated from established traditions in portraiture. So it's once again 2. So this is a short essay that's not worth 5. It's worth 6 points. That's something that they introduced 2 years ago, and I totally forgot about it because of the craziness of last year's exam. So most of the time on our quizzes, I give you 5-point essays, but occasionally there will be a 6-point too. Sometimes on the long essays, they're anywhere from 6, 7 to 8 as well, depending on the number of tasks. Okay, so what I'd like you guys to do is, I'm gonna go back to the presentation, but right here, I'd like you to take notes. These are easy 3 points of summative work, okay? So if we're looking for ways to bump up our grade, it's important that we take the notes. So you're gonna take the notes in the columns here, and then as homework, you're gonna answer part 2, you're gonna type in your response. Does that sound good? Okay, so let me go back to my presentation here. Okay, so let's pick apart the first task. Using 2 examples of specific visual evidence, explain how this work references established artistic traditions, right? I'm not looking for analyzing the artwork. What I want us to do is just to break apart what the question means, right? What is visual evidence? What would you type in those notes? What's visual evidence? If something is visual, what is it? Be a little bit louder. The form. It's stuff that you can see. So it's going to be things like form and style, right? It's going to be things like subject matter, right? It's going to be things like imagery. So actually I have it there. Here we go. Here's a list I do have. But notice I'm not necessarily dissecting this image. Feel free in your notes section to add notes that are specific to Cubism there, right? If you want to, but I'm really just requiring you to kind of pick apart the question. But you can add those additional notes to help you answer the question. And we are going to talk about this page before we go to it, right? So visual evidence is things that you can see. The media, right? So this is an oil painting, right? The texture or the technique, I should say. So how it's painted. Modeling, you know, that rendering of light and shadow. Subject matter, composition, so how it's organized. Things like proportion and realism are all things you can see, right? I didn't even put style there, so let me add style too. Okay, and then, right, it asks about artistic tradition. And this is probably something that's a little ambiguous. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of times we naturally talk about, we've been doing a lot of things chronological. And so we kind of forget about being able to relate things to the past, right? But when we're looking at artistic tradition, what are they talking about? They're talking about things that came before. So what are the things that came before, right? What are the things that came before Cubism? And so for this one, it's asking you how this work references established artistic tradition. So how is it similar, right? How is it similar to other traditional styles? So what I would suggest for something like this, right, is sometimes going back as far in your head as like Renaissance, right? Because during the Renaissance, they were really caught up in making things look perfect, representational, you know, perfect modeling, perfect detail. Everything was perfect. And it was smooth and it was perfected and it shows space and it's like a photographic representation of the ideal, right? And so we can go back as far as that to do like a comparison here, right? Another thing is that you could just go back 50 years if you wanted to. So you can think about things like Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, because remember that people like Picasso were inspired by Cézanne, right? They're a step like Cézanne. And so Another thing you could even talk about is maybe there's another artistic tradition. Maybe we're not even talking about the West, maybe we're talking about the East or the South. So, you know, of course, he was very much influenced by African art. Does that make sense? So then the second task, oh, I should ask, any questions on task 1? Okay, task 2, using 2 examples of specific visual evidence. So it's asking for visual evidence again. I'm not going to repeat the notes there because you already wrote it down, right? So it's from this one right here, visual, right? How does the word deviate? How is it different than the artistic tradition that we just talked about, right? So what are the things that are different? How does Cubism break the rules? So in your notes, right, you might want to focus on how it breaks the rules. I ran out of time this morning, so I didn't type this part in. My computer sadly shut down on me when I first got here today. So in your notes, right, we're focusing on how Cubism is different than Renaissance. How is Cubism different than Cezanne? How is it different than Impressionism? How is it different than traditional portraiture? Because this is a portrait of a person, right? Which I think is the next part of the question, is using 2 examples of specific contextual evidence. Oh my goodness, it's no longer visual. I think this one is kind of hard for modern and postmodern art. Because contextual is typically about history. It's typically about history. But when we get to modern art and postmodern art, normally we're talking about contextual imagery, or excuse me, contextual art image history. So instead of just like what the politics of the day or the religions of the day, what I would focus on with this question is how, you know, it's all about Cubism, right? So how is this Cubist portrait different than the established traditions in portraiture, right? It's asking, right, what's your contextual evidence, right? That's going to be the history component, right? So in your notes, right, with once again, the art history components of it, you know, how is Cubism different, right? I would really focus on how Cubism is different than these other styles of art. And then what are the traditions in portraiture, right? So how is Cubism deviating from the tradition of portrait painting? I apologize for not having a slide that has that a little bit more concrete for you guys. But like I said, I ran out of time. So does everyone have what their definition of contextual is? Right, so that's going to be about artistic art history. Sometimes it's more about time and place. And then how this is different than traditional portraiture with the emphasis on Cubism. Okay, so let's just look at the painting. We're not going to necessarily answer the question, but I bet you there's going to be some answers here for you that you can use on your question. So feel free to add them to your note takers. And then of course later, if it helps you to add it to the essay note section too, you can do that. But I would definitely write it in my note takers first so that you have it, right? So this is based on a Portuguese musician, a Portuguese musician that Braque saw in a bar in Marseille. So in a French, Marseille, in France, town of Marseille, he saw this Portuguese musician. Can you find the musician in this painting? Where is he? Can you find him? Can you see right here I'm going to circle it with the cursor. If you notice, you see his nose in profile, you see his eye, and he's holding a guitar. That's what this thing is right here. Right? And so here's a more traditional portrait of a musician, right? So it's a little bit different. So how is the work of Braque and of course Picasso similar to Cézanne? What are some similarities that you see? How are they influenced by Cézanne? Alana, can I pick on you? This is a little difficult, but I think you might be able to handle it.
Cézanne's painting is very fragmented by colors in the same way that Braque's painting is fragmented by like shattered pieces.
Right. So we have like different areas of value, but they are very rectilinear, right? And so you see kind of these rectilinear shapes of brushstroke in the landscape of Picasso. You see it in the sky, you see it in the mountains, and you see that in the portrait of this musician, right? And so there's an emphasis on constructing the painting, constructing the form, rather than a pure representation of this musician or of this landscape, right? And so how is this painting characteristic of analytical cubism? In what ways was Braque's technique traditional? So this is two different questions here, right? So it's formal rather than emotional. In analytical cubism, there's not a lot of emotional content. This is not Fauvism, this is not the bridge, right? It's all about constructivism, constructing the image. So they're shattering, picking apart, rearranging the image. You might have already wrote this stuff down based on analytical cubism. There's a merging of multiple views. Notice how his head looks like it's in profile, but his eye looks like it's in front view, right? So there's this merging of different points of view, and you can see how it feels kind of shattered and put back together. Literally, there's lines and angles and segments that look like they're just kind of arbitrarily put together, right? It doesn't look like all the pieces of the puzzle line up perfectly together. Notice how there's a merging of foreground and background. Why does the background and the foreground merge together? Why is it hard for me to see the difference between the foreground and the background? He uses the same what. He's repeating the same what over and over again. The same colors and the same brush style. Notice all these horizontal marks of color, right? He does it in the background. He does it in the foreground, right? He's using the same brown for the face as he does with the background, right? He's using a very limited palette of brown with some black and white to make it light and dark. Once again, notice that there's texture, right? But it's not necessarily like realistic texture. And then how it's traditional, at least one of them, is that it is a common subject matter of a portrait, right? So he's taking from tradition there. But it's not, perfectly 3D. It has a range of value, but it's not modeled and made to look two-dimensional. Right? So how is it innovative? Right? It's constructing the form, which we've already talked about. So he is thinking about color and value. Now I shouldn't say color because there's not a lot of color, right? But he's thinking about value. He's trying to repeat the same values in different places, kind of move your eye through the painting, right? He's trying to create harmony in using the same lightness, the same darkness throughout. he's really focusing on how to construct that form. He's showing his mark making, he's showing his brushstroke. He wants people to know that this was made by his artist. Another way that this is innovative is he was using some like technical things used from graphic design. And so some of the phrases of the music by the Portuguese musician is written in the image using stenciling. And so Cubism would often employ things from other art media, like graphic design for stenciling, but they would also incorporate sheets of music, text. And we haven't seen a lot of that before, other than maybe like religious text in a painting. But here, the text is used in a visual way. Right? And so how is it here to say, oh, this is Majoli, this is actually Picasso. So I just wanted to show you how similar their work was. Right? So it's, we already talked about this, so I'm not gonna worry about it. So I'll show you some more. This is another Picasso portrait, right? This one is a little bit more recognizable. Picasso did a lot of portraits of his art dealers. So here's one. Here's another one of his art dealers. But remember that Braque and Picasso were really focusing on traditional techniques and subject matter of still life, right? Landscape and portraiture. Okay. This is another Picasso. This is kind of the merging of analytical cubism with synthetic, which is where you add things. This is a good example of how cubists start to be kind of like looking at everyday objects. That rope is real rope that Picasso added to the outside of this round painting. And this chair painting that you see here was actually wallpaper. So they're collaging, they're painting and gluing in other imagery, right? So this one is totally collage, right? With a little bit of drawing on top. So they would often use sheet music, newspapers, labels from things like wine to incorporate in their image. And so this was done in painting and in printmaking. Synthetic cubism is the building up of composition from simpler forms. So they are often gluing imagery together to create a layered look. They think that the material brings meaning. So if you use a newspaper in your painting, it would make people go, oh, that's a newspaper, and that would add to their understanding of the artwork. Right? The painting seems to become an object on its own. And in synthetic cubism, sometimes there's a little bit more color. Right? So you can see that these collages are much more colorful. But notice once again that there's a building of form rather than a breaking apart of form. So he constructed the musical instrument. So there's a lot of common everyday subject matter for artists. So we have a lot of musicians, musical instruments. This is a sculpture by Picasso. These are two wall paintings. This is musical instruments again. And so Picasso used synthetic cubism to do things like these three musicians, right? But he got kind of sick of cubism because he was afraid it wasn't emotional enough. And so he actually started to paint some very realistic paintings. And in his more realistic paintings, he started to try to exude more emotion. And so he was able to translate some of that emotion from the realism into his abstraction. And so he started to work more surrealistically. He added like joy. I see like influence on the teeth on this one on the left, right? She seems very joyful, even though she kind of looks like a monster, right? Here's more reflective in this mirrored image on the right, right? He's pretty notorious womanizer. So a lot of his imagery, like this one, was of one of his many affairs or wives. And so he wasn't very like, didn't show women as being very beautiful in his style. So here's a little cartoon, right? And so I don't want to spend a lot of time because it's not in the 250, but during World War II, for the World Exhibition, he painted a very large mural based on a bombing of the city of Guernica. And so this is a really good example of how he used Cubism to create emotional content. Because remember, early on, Cubism wasn't necessarily about emotion, it was about form, right? So he used a lot of symbols of Spanish pride, as well as images of war to create this nightmarish image. And one of the things you might notice is that it's in black and white. He intentionally wanted it to look like it was a newspaper. And so it's very much based on a political commentary of how the Spanish under Franco allowed the Nazis to bomb a city called Guernica. Okay, we're going to stop there today. So on Friday, make sure that you submit your essay question, right? Make sure you do that. We'll probably be able to go over it in class that day as well, depending on how many of you guys turn it in. I guess the majority of you will go over it right away. Are there any questions before you guys go? Okay, I will see you guys again on Friday. Don't forget about your.
Thank you.
Bye. Go back and fix this while I am